David's going to show us all there is to know about old trees, right, David?
I am. Welcome, everyone. I'll go ahead and with having George here, I'm going to try to switch over to my presentation mode here, and we'll go ahead and get started. May take a minute or so. Okay, George, can you tell me if you can see the screen? All right, we'll go to presentation mode. We're still looking good? All right, let's go ahead and get started because this is going to be 3 hours long. No, it's just an hour. Um, so welcome. I'm David Gavatsky. I'm actually a former Vermonter. I currently live over in the White Mountains in New Hampshire, in Jefferson, and I have a strong interest in old growth forest. Always have. I've been a forester for most of my life and a silviculturist. I've worked on the Green Mountain National Forest, the White Mountain National Forest here, and Colorado and Oregon and Minnesota and Michigan. And I've always, I love trees, obviously working in the woods all my life, I continue to really enjoy it. So this afternoon, and George is taping this, I'm going to be talking about old growth forest and why they're so important. And I'll be featuring several of the really nice old growth forests in Vermont. There's actually about 50 different old growth forests that are in the state. So some of the topics, I mean, you can read this. What is an old growth forest? And how do we identify it? So this is for you when you go out hiking, that you can actually get some ideas on how to identify an old growth forest. And as I said, why are they important? How much old growth forest is left in Vermont, and where you can go see them. So, there's all kinds of definitions of what an old growth forest is. And being a silviculturist and a forester, I've thought about it long and hard, and I've really gone with a fairly simple description, and lots of other people have their own descriptions. But my definition is it's a natural forest as opposed to a plantation that has developed over a long period of time, at least 150 years or more, and has not been disturbed by stand replacing events such as logging, windstorms, or forest fires. And it may take 200 years or so, but I try to have a fairly broad definition which allows some discussion on what it is. And there's lots of other names for old growth forest. Ancient old forest is a common one that we actually use a lot in New England. Primeval, virgin, over mature, I mean decadent. Some scientists in Europe like to use the term primary forest, and another term is late successional. So the characteristics, if you're out looking for an old growth forest, here are some of the characteristics that we typically have. And I'll be talking about each of these, so you don't have to memorize all of them. And I'll point them out, where you can see them in Vermont. But, standing large old trees, that's certainly one of the things that you'll see. Very interesting structural diversity, meaning the trees are not all of the same size and height or even species. So you'll have different canopy layers. Snags, which are standing dead trees. Coarse woody debris. These are branches and logs that are lying on the ground. We call it coarse woody debris. And of course, you don't see signs of humans. You don't see stone walls, roads, or other things that are there. Pit and mound topography, I'll explain in detail, as I will with nurse logs, canopy gaps. Broken top trees, these trees have been around a long time, 200 years or more. So they've seen a lot of winters and a lot of storms coming through. So they often have broken tops. And many of the old growth forests have a variety of mosses and lichens that are really quite rich, and lots of them have cavities and hollow trees. So this is of course a sugar maple estate tree of Vermont, and this is up at Wilmarth Woods, and Addison, and it's near Snake Mountain, if you're familiar with that. But again, this is an old growth forest stand, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. But some of the tools that we use, one of them is probably one of the most important ones. It's called an increment borer, and all of them are now made in Sweden, one factory. And it consists of a extractor, or what we call a spoon, an auger, which is kind of a drill, and then a handle that goes into it. As you can see on the screen, on the picture in the lower area here, this is drilling into a tree to pull out a core. And essentially what you do is you drill into the center of the tree, and you can read the rings. And I'll show you what a core looks like. So the center of the tree, obviously, that's the first year of growth. You try to get it as low as you can. Otherwise, you'll be adding a few years as it's a little seedling. And then you can see some differences. Also, if you're really looking at it, some years have a lot of rain, so a lot of moisture. So these rings are spread apart quite a bit more. You can see a scar from a forest fire here, and then you can see sometimes when it was really dry. So trees really produce 2 rings a year, at least in eastern United States. They have what's called the spring, early summer growth, which is fairly light colored and fairly wide. And then they have this late summer or fall wood, and that tends to be dark. So what I do is I just count the dark rings, easier to count, and I just work my way on out. So that's essentially how you do it. But this is what it looks like when you're out in the field. And this was done by a friend of mine, Chris Kane, in 1997. He was given the assignment to inventory a state park, Mount Sunapee State Park in New Hampshire. And so he did a number of core samplings here.
Thank you.
And then he just put them on a little block here and sanded them down. And then when he counted the number of rings, it actually came out to be 180 rings, 180 years old. He says, the date on it and what location, and that is a 28.5 inch diameter red spruce. And so 180 years old. So, they discovered a pretty good stand of red spruce that's there. We also use other characteristics to look at trees to determine if it indeed is an old growth forest. And one of them is the bark. And old trees have really, really interesting bark. You could never tell it was, for instance, a black cherry tree. Here, that platy bark here. This tree was pretty close to 250 years old, and it's growing in a cold air talus slope. Quite interesting. And this tree, I call it the money tree because it was growing $2 bills. Actually, that's all I had in my wallet, but it's a yellow birch tree with large platy bark here. So you don't find that on young trees. Here's another one. This is down in Vernon. This is near where Sarah lives, near Brattleboro. It's in the Vernon Black Gum Swamp. And you can call it alligator bark or reptile bark because you could slide your hand in between the bark crevices here. So it tells me that this is a really old tree. And this happens to be black gum, and I'll be talking more about that.
We can't see it. We can't see it.
Large old trees, they're essentially the building blocks of the old growth forest. And this is yellow birch tree, is about 200 years old. And the structural diversity that I was talking about, you get a variety of trees.
We're not seeing your slides moving. There we go. Thanks.
Okay. There must be a little bit slow catching up. Thanks for telling me. So the structural diversity is, so it's a mix of old and young and middle-aged trees and species at different canopy levels. Some are in the understory, like the beech over here, and these others, and there's sugar maple, yellow birch, and hemlock that are in the overstory, and some, like this spruce that's just coming in, is in the mid-story. that's happening here. So structural diversity is found in old growth forest. Snags. A snag is a standing dead tree, and this is one of them here. Trees, when they're alive, are very important for habitat, and even when they're dead and standing as a snag, they're very important. We call them wildlife apartment houses, condominiums. And even when they fall down and they're lying on the ground, they're still important because they're still providing that habitat for salamanders and insects and fungus that are decomposing it. And
David,
and
we
that-
can't see the snag.
you just see a snag?
We can't see it.
You can't. Let me go back here. Yeah, I'm not sure what's happening. You should see a slide that says snag.
Structural diversity.
Oh, you're still on structural diversity. Oh, hold on. Yeah, you're way back. Okay, right there. And how about now?
Yes.
Okay, so let me go to the views thing here. You see the word snag?
Yes.
Okay, good. Yeah, this is a white pine snag, and it's a mixed white pine hemlock stand, and has pretty big snag. Okay, I'm showing another one. Hopefully you can see it. This is down in Arlington, Vermont. This is a white pine snag that I measured. It was 80 feet tall. And you don't want to go out there on a windy day in case the tree decides to come down. Okay, you folks see a slide that says hollow trees and hollow logs?
Yep.
Okay, good. We're catching up then. So really important habitat. People say, well, these hollow trees aren't very important, but it's amazing. A bear can actually move into that. A friend of mine, John Pastori, has actually got his head stuck in here. It's just checking the interior, and raccoons and porcupines and bats in the summertime, they'll use these hollow trees for habitat. So there's a lot of wildlife value in these hollow trees, and particularly, these living trees with internal pockets of decay, dieback, broken tops. They're really, really important for habitat. So,
David,
sometimes.
the slide hasn't come fully in.
Okay. I don't know why it's not moving.
Okay, that's better.
That's okay. Maybe I'll just do on this particular thing, so you'll get to see what's coming up next. I just mentioned an article that's here, and then can you see the American marten?
Yeah.
Okay, good. American marten, formerly called a pine marten, they love old growth forest, and the species is in the weasel family, and it loves to eat red squirrels. And of course, red squirrels love mature forest because that's where the spruce and fir cones are, where they get their food. So in the Green Mountains and in the White Mountains and the Adirondacks, you do have marten that live in these older forests. Pretty cool animal. I really like them. And again, hollow but live trees have lots of homes for wildlife. It's American basswood, probably raccoons that are living up in here. Could be gray squirrels. They built a nest in that hollow. American beech on the other side. That's hollow. I mean, that would be good bat habitat there. And then of course cavity trees. This is a balsam fir tree that's just loaded with pileated woodpecker holes, and again providing habitat for nuthatches and chickadees and all kinds of other cavity nesting birds. And if you had to pick an iconic species of old growth forest in Vermont, I would pick the flying squirrel. whether it's the northern flying squirrel, which is primarily found in the conifer forest, the spruce and fir forest, or the southern flying squirrel, which is found more in the deciduous or hardwood forest. You know, they're the trees, the mammals that really love these old growth forests because there's so many cavities that they can live in, and they tend to disperse seeds, and they actually take fungi, mushrooms, and things, and they bury them, which actually helps the the spread, the mycorrhizal layer that's found in the environment. So they have so many important factors um, in their role. So coarse woody debris typically is material that's 3 inches in diameter and larger. And of course, this is really a large one. This is probably 30 inches in diameter, and it's fallen down on the ground, and it just is full of life. There's lots of fungus on it, and there's salamanders that are living there, chipmunks and mice and squirrels and you name it that will enjoy that. This won't be on the test, but we do have a classification system that we use in forest inventory when we take what's called a plot, and you'll come to a particular point and you'll look around and you'll inventory all of these different stages of life on trees. You know, in many cases it's like people that, hopefully we don't end up, being down here in log decomposition class 5, but hopefully we're at stage 1 all the time. Again, coarse woody debris, valuable habitat, all of these logs and branches that are down, quite nice. And again, many amphibians, including this red eft, love this coarse woody debris. And the forest is just, you would be amazed by how many salamanders are in these old growth forests because they're like reservoirs. The logs just soak up so much moisture and the moss layer here. And so you get this is yellow birch that's starting to come in, and there's a balsam fir that's starting to grow over here. And then there's a paper birch that's also coming in on this log. So they're reservoirs of moisture, and they just do really well to provide the habitat. And that's why we call them nurse logs. They're nurse logs for yellow birch and other species. And here's another nurse log. This is actually a paper birch growing out of this nurse log right here. There were 6 different species of trees that was growing on this down white spruce log. So that was quite interesting, and they're quite important. And I'm going to mention here, when you're out hiking, sometimes you'll see what's called a stilt root. And we all know what stilts are when you're walking with them. And the one on the right here is a white spruce, and it looks like it grew on stilts. But at one time, it actually grew on a stump. The stump was in the center here. The material is rotted away. And here's a hemlock. It's a little bit hard to see coming up here, but this is a stump that's rotting away. And the root system will kind of go down here, and you'll see what the result is. And so, again, this is an old yellow birch tree, and this was where the stump used to be. So that's why that's called the stilt root. These trees are remarkably strong because, remember, the only part of the tree that's actually alive is a thin band around the outer edge. Another thing that we look for in old growth forest are canopy gaps. These are where a tree has died and we have a lot of new sunlight that's coming in. Big trees coming in, and when you get that sunlight, you get this real flourishing of growth, young trees that grow in afterwards. So those are called canopy gaps. And I can tell you, walking through canopy gaps is not the most fun thing in the world. Here's another one that's down in Arlington, Vermont, that I'll be showing you more pictures of. Really interesting place to go. So pit and mound topography, and I'll show you in a couple slides here. What happens when trees get blown over, they pull up a big wad of earth and other material and create a depression. And we call it pit and mound topography. And the mounds are basically what's left of the root system, and the pits are where it took all of the soil away from it. And here's a better example. This is the wind throw. Here, a tree is blown over, and this mound has come up, and then you have a pit here. And pit and mound topography in old growth forest are very, very common. And a lot of places in Vermont, New Hampshire, and New York, they were farmed. They got rid of the rocks. They smoothed it over so that they could, raise hay or allow dairy cows to come in. So if there's any former agriculture there, you would see fairly flat ground as opposed to this pit and mound topography. So if you're studying forensics, that's the thing to see. Again, here's another mound here, and here's the pit. So some tree fell over, exposed mineral soil, and you got a white birch. This is actually a really old white birch tree. I think it was 90 or 100 years old that came in. And the tree size does not necessarily indicate how old it is. You could have a big tree that's really not that old, because you look here on these flat-topped hemlocks, pretty characteristic of hemlocks that have been suppressed from sunlight. These trees are 100 years old, at least. This is at a research forest on the Pisgah Forest in New Hampshire, actually just across the river from Brattleboro, really. And they measure the age of these trees, about 100 years of age. Now, if these other trees around here died and you created sunlight, these trees would really flourish. And hemlock trees can live to be 550 years old. Trees with broken tops. Here's a broken top over here again from the weather. You can see a lot of these. We have a term for it. We call them stag-headed, which is they look more like deer antlers. And different kinds of mosses and lichens. This is a Necaria moss or shingle moss that grows on the base of trees. And it takes a long time to develop that. And again, same thing with the usnea or the old man's beard. And you get some of these that are very, very long. And not only does it indicate a really old tree, it indicates really good air quality to have lichens like that growing. And we've all heard about the wood wide web. Suzanne Simard wrote a book on this essentially. She's from British Columbia, and she talked about how trees actually communicate with each other, and it's called a mycorrhizal network. And to simplify it, I think it was Smithsonian or Nature magazine, called it the wood wide web. It's where trees actually interconnect, and they graft, and they actually provide nutrients and other information to the other trees. And so there's some nutrient flow that goes back and forth, for instance, between this yellow birch and hemlock tree. And you don't get that in these younger forests. And of course, you get lots of fungus. You have the coral mushroom here and the honey mushrooms here. And you get, of course, lots of interesting birds that show up. And if I had to pick one bird, I think for, the old forest, it would have to be the pileated woodpecker, because it loves these big trees, and it requires big trees really to nest, because it's a bird the size of a crow. A smaller bird is the brown creeper, and they look for loose bark where they can forage and nest in. And tiny cryptic colored bird, they're around all winter, and I've seen a few of them. And of course, winter wrens. I just heard my first two yesterday when I was out on a hike. And wrens in particular, they always have that tail that sticks straight up in the back here. This one isn't quite so much, but they love to use these tip-up mounds for nesting. Red crossbills, they love the old spruce trees and pine forest. This is a red crossbill. They prefer pine forest, and the white-winged crossbills prefer spruce. They're just a difference in the size of the bill. Another species of bird that we'll have showing up in probably just about a month, maybe a little over a month, around the 10th of May, is Blackburnian warbler. And a fire throat is another name for it. And they prefer these mature conifer forests, in particular hemlock forest, because that's where they forage. So a little bit about the importance of old growth forest and climate change. We hear, a couple terms, carbon sequestration and carbon storage. And what we know is that these old growth forests, they store an amazing amount of carbon. And it's important because carbon in the atmosphere, too much of it, is what's causing the climate change that we're facing right now. So you'll hear an argument made that younger forests sequester more carbon, but the fact is that older trees have a much larger amount of carbon that they store, that they can store and they can lock up, and that's why it's important. So, again, sequestration is the rate at which a forest sequesters carbon. Changes over time. So it's typically these younger trees when they're 30 to 70 years old that have that. Professor William Keeton, he's from the University of Vermont. He's a well-acknowledged expert about old growth forest in New England. And what he found in this study was that older forests in eastern North America are less vulnerable to climate change than younger forests, and particularly for carbon storage, timber production, and biodiversity. So that's an important concept. He came up with that a few years ago. He's a prolific author and a proponent of having old growth forest around. And Vermont, of course, has a goal of 9% of Vermont's forest to be an old growth. And right now it's less than 1%. So they've got a ways to go, but a lot of the forests surprisingly are getting up there in the years. And Professor Keeton, or Bill Keeton, has some ideas on how to accentuate that development of old growth forests. So keep an eye out for some of the things that he has. All right, well, let's switch over now for the final part of the program here. And let's talk about, I picked a dozen sites in Vermont. I'll talk about some of them and where to go see old growth forest. And as I said, there's about 50 of them, but about 30 of these are high elevation stands, such as on Mount Mansfield or Camel's Hump or Mount Abraham, that are really high elevation forest. And a lot of us are interested in the ones at lower elevations, where you get to see the bigger trees and that. So let's go ahead and take a look. We'll go around the state here and pick some of the areas. Wilmarth Woods in Addison, Snake Mountain, you may have heard of that. It's one of the best examples of a beech sugar maple forest. It did have a little bit of sugaring and potentially some sheep grazing at an earlier stage, but from what we can tell, it's probably been free from disturbance for at least 100 years of age. And you have some amazingly big trees, and it's a pretty easy, gentle trail until you get to the base of Snake Mountain, then it goes up. But really the best part is on both sides as you're going in Addison. This is American basswood and American beech. And this particular beech here, it's interesting. You can see the root system, the way it's coming out here. So there must be a clay pan underneath it or a hard pan, which forces the root systems. They can't penetrate it, so they tend to go out. But this is a really beautiful American beech. So much of our American beech now is scarred up because we have this beech scale Nectaria complex that's damaging them. And of course, you've got lots of sugar maple. And as you can see here, there's trees of varying sizes and ages and species that are coming through here.
So Dave, I have a question. An old growth forest isn't necessarily, you don't walk in a forest and every single tree is old and big.
Right, that's correct. You have a percentage of trees that are that old. Oh, hold on here. Let me just turn off this phone. There we go. you'll have a pretty good percentage of trees that are really quite large and quite old. But at the same time, you're going to have trees that are middle-aged and some trees that are really quite young.
Okay, I get it.
And Wilmarth Woods, this is a Nature Conservancy forest, has some beautiful northern red oak that are in there. And that's not far from the Richmond area. And so it's worth a hike. And particularly, in the next, several weeks here and before the leaves come on the trees, you can really see a lot of what's going on. Now, the classic old growth forest that was long thought to be the best one in Vermont, and they're all good. Some are better than others, but is here in Killington at Gifford Woods State Park. It's only 13 acres in size. It's bisected by a highway that goes through it, so it's not a large area, but it's one of those classic sugar maple old growth forest, and I would recommend a visit down there. There's what's really interesting is there's a interpretive trail, and the interpretive trail goes right through the center of the old growth, and it has these interpretive panels that you can stop and you can learn more about it. It's only a third of a mile long because, like I say, it's not a really big forest here, but it's certainly worth going to and learning more about it. It's a classic, and I mean some of the sugar maple trees that are in there are 36 inches in diameter and just huge. And there's a campground near there, so that's worth checking out. Another one is this one in Arlington. This is the Fisher Scott Memorial Pines State Natural Area. It's a little tricky to find. It's not well marked, but you can look it up and find a GPS that will take you to it. It's about 30 acres in size and famous, of course, for its white pines. It's also a registered national natural landmark with the National Park Service because of its unusually old and really big white pine trees here. And this white pine that's lying on the ground is over 140 feet long and had fallen down. There's still a lot of ones that are out there, and just a great place to visit if you're heading down towards Manchester off of Route 7 through the Valley of Vermont. It's worth a stop. I think it's only about a mile up from Route 7 the last time I was there to visit. But lovely place, and it was raining out when I was there, and it was just so nice. It'd be really nice in the fog even to see something like that. The next one is I call it the Vernon Black Gum Swamps, but its official name, because it's a town forest, is the J. Maynard Miller Forest. And if you look it up, you'll come to the Vernon Black Gum Swamp. But this is down in Vernon, Vermont, in the southeast corner of the state, not far from the Connecticut River. But it's a really spectacular series of swamps with black gum trees. And black gum trees, I mean, they're really not many places in Vermont that you'll find these trees. In fact, there's one tree in New Hampshire that is 716 years old. It's the oldest black gum that we know of in North America. And that's just an amazing tree. One of the reasons why it was never cut was that it's kind of shaped like a pretzel, the way it grows out, and you couldn't just get a straight wood, and the farmers and loggers never really thought much of black gum for making lumber out of it. So it's there, and I think if you had a chance and you're down in that area, it's a wonderful hike, less than a mile. All right, this is a little further north. This is up in Cambridge, Vermont, and you got to look for the sign that says Mountain View Cemetery. And you say, wow, a cemetery. Well, there's actually a ravine behind it that has amazing white pines and hemlocks that are growing there. And there's plenty of space to park. There's no trail that's there, but these trees are 200 years old, 140, 150 feet tall. Just an amazing place to visit. And over in the Northeast Kingdom, where I typically spend most of my time when I'm in Vermont, is Spectacle Pond Natural Area. This is in Essex County. It's in Brighton. Most people call Brighton Island Pond, if you're familiar with that term. But there's a nice interpretive trail that goes out from Brighton State Park on Spectacle Pond, and you can learn all about this old growth red pine that are found here. There's a Native American site, the Abenaki community, formerly was out here. So these trees are not particularly old, in the 150-year range, but they're doing pretty well, and the setting is just so neat. Of course, here's the setting. That's my four-legged daughter here that is there. My wife's in the center. There's two friends from the Netherlands that came to visit, and and you go to Europe, and there's not a lot of wild nature, and they just loved being here in northern New England to visit places like this. And one last one. This is not too far from you in Ferrisburg. It's called Kingsland Bay State Park. And yeah, I don't know when they found this particular one, but it's a northern white cedar cliff community. And there's parking and restrooms at the trailhead. And there is actually a trail that goes over the top here. And these northern white cedars, this is Lake Champlain over here in New York on the other side, just growing here up to 180 years old. So just a fabulous place to visit. And that is the end of my program.
Well, that was wonderful.
Good.
Thanks, David.
All right, so let me get out of this, and hopefully I won't shut down completely here. Wait, I think this is how I do it. Stop presenting. There we go. All right, so what do we have for questions? Any questions
David,
here?
Yeah, David, do most of these forests, the old growth forests, happen where, high up on top of the mountaintop somewhere where they couldn't be logged? Is that why they still survived?
Yeah, that's a good question, Ray. It typically areas that they couldn't log, too rocky, too steep, too wet, too high up. And that's the example of most of what we have in the northeastern United States, with the exception, of course, of being the Adirondacks, which was protected by the people in New York in the 1890s before they really got into heavy logging. So in the case of Gifford Woods, you're saying, well, it's right near Killington, it's right near the highway. What happened? It was a landowner who all he did was to do some sugaring, some light sugaring in there, and so it was otherwise protected. Even today, with sugaring, you tend to lower the density of the trees that are there. It was probably not known in the 1920s before he donated it to the people of Vermont. But today, these sugar maple stands tend to be, quite a bit of management that goes on them, and they're opened up quite a bit to develop bigger crowns. And again, some of these other places, like the Vernon Black Gum Swamp, it's because the wood just wasn't useful for any lumber, but it's been logged all around there. And in fact, it's been logged within the last 20 years because it's part of the town forest, but they did protect the sensitive areas.
What kind of trees would you find in wet, swampy areas?
Well, in that particular case, it's black gum and hemlock that grow there.
Okay.
If you go to the Northeast Kingdom, what you find is black spruce and occasionally white spruce and tamarack that grow there. Now, black spruce you can get growing 300 years of age, so you don't find much logging because often the trees are fairly small in diameter, but they're really old. And I've taken a 3-inch diameter black spruce and it was 150 years old because it's in the really cold, boggy habitat where the growing season is quite a bit shorter. Good question. Any other questions? Any questions for Sarah, who's here from the Old Growth Forest Network?
Got any questions?
No other questions. Well, if you, oh, someone's raised a hand.
Yeah, who's taking care of all these forests? It sounds like some are in conservancies, but are they mostly protected now?
All of the ones I showed are public. There are some privately owned ones that have conservation easements on them. That was on that initial list I sent out. And I can actually send Diane a list of, I think it's 10 of them that the Vermont Land Trust, has, and that might be of interest to you. And you can visit all 10 of those. There are some others that we've identified that are privately owned and trying to get conservation easements to reward the landowner so that they won't harvest those trees, and they'll be preserved for the future. And that's one of the the missions, is to identify for Sarah and myself, to identify these areas and try to protect these trees, because they're in such short supply. There's less than 1%. I certainly believe in harvesting trees because we need the supply of wood, but it's just how much and what we want to protect. We want to protect these really living reservoirs of science and tree vigor for the future. Whether Vermont's ever going to get to 9%, I don't know. It'll take time. It'll be hard, but you don't know until you try. And with the inventorying that's going on by various people, I think they'll determine that maybe there's more than 1% that's out there. Maybe there's 2 or 3%. Maybe there's another 3% that in another 20 years of careful management that will meet that standard too. So that's the hope. You have to be optimistic and hopeful, and when you're working with any kind of a plant, farmers know that, and foresters know that. It's just in forestry, it's not just a 1-year crop. It's you're thinking out 100, 200, 300 years out to protect these trees.
Knox has a question.
Yeah, hi. Thanks for your presentation. I'm sorry I missed the beginning of it. I guess kind of segueing from what you were just saying, the current use program, has been sort of focused on logging and maybe a little bit of deer yard.
You want to make
but I understand that there's some changes happening there, and could you speak to, what kind of characteristics could go into future old growth forests that, we're seeing now, not as old growth, but could become so if allowed to by the program and management?
That's a great question, Knox. The Vermont legislature has been studying this issue, and they're working with Department of Forest and Lands in Vermont to come up with some working definitions, because previously, if you wanted to have that current use exemption on the taxes, it had to be really a working forest or something really special about it. Now they're come up with, and I'm not up to date on the latest changes, but they're trying to come up with forests that are not going to be logged because they're there for the spiritual values, they're there for the carbon storage and all of these other factors that I've been talking about. So that's up and coming, and there's some areas near Montpelier where recently were acquired in the 4,000 acre range, and so I think the landowner is very interested in getting that tax benefit by not logging the forest, and that this would be a benefit to the people of Vermont. Hopefully that answered your question. I'll have to look into that a little bit more, but I get Vermont Digger and some of the other Vermont publications, they're always talking about that. Sarah, do you know any more on that?
I don't. I know that it's they're looking at it, but I don't have any detail.
I'm pretty hopeful that they'll come up with a, a plan. In New Hampshire, where I live here, we have a couple different scales for the current use, and if yours is in, it's available for recreation and that you get a certain amount. But if it's like a white pine forest and you're planning on logging, you get a higher benefit for it, but it's not significantly different. So
I was wondering, this is a question for you, Sarah. If you have any indigenous people involved with your program, preserving old growth forests?
Yeah, it's something that we've been looking at, and just recently started putting at the very least started putting the indigenous folks whose land our forests are on our website, and trying to do some work in that regard. I know that one of my colleagues is working with the indigenous populations in Alaska pretty heavily right now. That's the one that I know for sure that we are.
in September of 2023, we're going to have an old growth forest conference. It's going to be at the Geneva Point, which is on Lake Winnipesaukee in New Hampshire. It's a 3-day conference, and we're going to have a effort to bring in indigenous speakers and potentially and have field trips, but primarily to talk about the indigenous role of these old growth forests and their values, and certainly there's a lot of interest in providing this for the gathering of medicinal materials and other products that come out of these older forests. So we're definitely, that's on our radar screen, and we're definitely want to work with that. And fortunately now, of course, Vermont is a state recognized the Abenaki, and we have Chief Don Stevens of the Nulhegan Band, and then we have a Missisquoi population, and then the Elnu, and so they're recognized by the state. New Hampshire is not as forward thinking, but we do have a fair number of indigenous people that are in New Hampshire that we've been working with and we recognize. Yeah, great question.
What kind of diversity in wildlife is there? I think of old growth as having heavy canopies, so not much growing on the forest floor. I may be completely wrong, but
you're often right. There's a lot of diversity because of these canopy gaps where you do get a lot of that sunlight coming in, and then other areas where it kind of looks like a desert, particularly in these hemlock stands that have very, very thick overstory. There's really no wildlife species that is completely dependent on old growth forest for their life cycle. At certain points in their life cycle, a lot of birds are more abundant in old growth forest, like the Blackburnian warbler, olive-sided flycatcher, yellow-bellied flycatcher, winter wren, and some of the other warblers that are found there, because that's the habitat they prefer. But it depends on the time of the year and what food availability there is. So in some ways, these old growth forests provide more of the homes as opposed to maybe more of the food. It's these large trees with large cavities that they can nest in, and then these animals go to forage elsewhere. One thing that these old growth forests have, particularly with trout streams, is that they tend to shade these streams, provide this cooling temperature that brook trout need, for instance, and so that's an important factor. So you could also have an early successional stand that's been clear cut, essentially, say a 30-acre stand nearby, and that's where you're going to get a lot of berries and soft mast that's produced for deer and for bear and other species. So you'll tend to have a greater accumulation in that kind of forest. But again, that's for feeding, and the bears are probably going to be looking for an area to den up in November, December, and that's not going to be in that clear cut. It's often going to be in an old growth forest where there's logs to curl up next to. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. I appreciate you sticking around for an hour of your time. And if you have any questions, Diane and George know how to get a hold of me. And Martha, thank you for introducing me. And I hope everyone has a good rest of the week.
Thank you,
Thanks, David. That was great.
Thanks, David.
Thank you,
Yep.
David.
Take care. Hope to see you on the trail.